This one was a study that looked at messages of hope and despair and conflict, and how political ideologies can influence these effects. So that was kind of the primary focus. So they wanted to answer the questions of how do these messages impact people involved in an intractable conflict. In this case, they looked at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well. Is one more impactful than the other? So do messages of hope or despair have a greater impact? And in what ways can political ideology influence the effects of those messages on the people receiving them? So they did two studies. They were actually very identical. Study 2 was just a repeat of study 1, trying to get a larger representation of people. And so they had participants for both studies, all of who were Israeli Jews. They wanted to evaluate how they reacted to messaging. So they had a hope condition, a despair condition, and a control condition where they were just simply, looking for more information. So they gave them some information to read about a study that was from a trusted resource, and it leaned one way or the other, or not at all. So they once they read that, they were supposed to answer questions and feedback. So they did have measures and scales. They gauged their reading comprehension to make sure they fully understood what was happening and what, that they understood whether it was the hope or despair condition, etc. And then they asked them their questions on their feelings, and they kind of gauged that in the sense of whether they felt a hope for peace to resolve the conflict, whether they had a sense of urgency to resolve the conflict, and if they supported concessions to end the conflict. So if you can go to the next page. So what they found for study 1 and study 2 were that leftists, anyone who fell on the left in any way, so as long as they were just from center political spectrum to the left, so it could be a little bit or very extreme left. Same with the right. And then they also had, for both studies, a variance of who they had on the left, right, and centrally. So leftists were shown in both studies to be heavily impacted by the manipulations. Rightists were not impacted at all for any of those measures that they looked at. So the sense of urgency, the hope for peace, they did not seem to be impacted, whether it was hope or despair. There wasn't a significant difference for leftists in terms of hope, but when it came to despair, that impacted them quite a bit. So they found that it was a lot easier to instill a sense of despair than it was to instill a sense of hope. But that the hope is more critical for trying to resolve the conflict at hand, because if you're hopeful that there is a resolution to be had, you may feel a greater sense of urgency because you feel that you may actually be able to change something. So it's important to be able to instill that, but it's much easier to fall the other way. They have, and they talk about, there should be some further studies around this, but they conclude that this may be because of the ideology, that rightists tend to be a little bit more strict and rigid in their sense of what they believe and in their values, and it comes down a lot to threat perception, and leftists tend to be a little bit more okay with uncertainty and tend to kind of lean more towards like care and concern, and that for kind of like a broad spectrum. So that's where they feel like they were a little bit more impacted. But what that tells us is that our political leanings can greatly influence our perception of a conflict, and our ability and desire to resolve the said conflict. Hope is harder to instill than despair, and even more so for certain groups of people. So understanding how this applies to conflicts in general and things like intractable conflicts is really important, and could be a helpful way to at least start to find peace in the future if we can better understand how to get those messages out. And our sense of urgency and desire to resolve conflict means a lot when we actually want to take actions further. So how we feel about those things and whether we think there is a resolution to be had will say a lot for whether we actually can move forward.
So yeah, this is interesting. I like it's a pretty straightforward design, which is nice. What was the method that was used? Was they read a research paper? Is that right?
It was a paper that was presented from, and they mentioned the source. It's something that's in that region. It's supposed to be like a trusted, reliable source. And it gave them a message of, recent research has shown us that in X, Y, and Z situation, that things can lean towards a hopeful or a despair route. So it was kind of saying, like, we see that there is hope to resolve the situation, or we see that there is not a lot. The research shows us that we don't think that there will be a resolution to the conflict. The control condition was given something that said, we need more research to determine whether we think there can be a resolution. And I believe it was about actually the conflict at hand in the region. Can try to find those exact.
Yeah. I'm just curious because so when we think about study design, it's an interesting, so it's this interesting opening to like researcher bias, and I don't know how they framed the results or discussion, but like the question is, okay, so it's easy to infer that, like, let's say people leaning left are more influenced by what they read or something, but we have to remember, like, they're more influenced by this particular method. So there could be other methods that could work better for people on the right on one hand, and then on this. So, and do we know which way the research paper publication, which way that leans? Do more left people buy into that publication than right? So they trust it more or something like that. So, there could be some other confounding factors, right?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think that's the hard and fast rule, of course, for whether people on one side or the other can be, influenced in some way. I think it's important, as people do research kind of in that regard, to find out though what ways people are influenced, because if there's, so if there's so much saying that hope can lead you at least on the right path to resolving conflict, then finding out how you can influence that or build that for people is really important.
Yeah. I mean, hope is a big element, I think, or I think they call what they would call optimism. Right. Resolution optimism, or transformation optimism. Like, what are the correct methods of instilling optimism for certain types of people or groups, either groups of people or certain types of personalities or something like that. Yeah, because it reminds me of what we were just talking about too with the news. It was like easier to get people to feel despair than it is to get people to feel hope. And so maybe, that's why despair sells, right? And something like that. So.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if it taps into fear, I mean, it makes sense. I feel like, unfortunately, I feel like fear is, I don't know. Fear is such a great motivator here that it's hard to, you almost need more evidence for hope to even come up. If you have a huge, and if you like, I mean, if you think of, I don't know where this study was taking place, but if you think of like psychological needs, like psychological safety, and not feeling that you're like feeling physically in some way threatened or violated, especially in intractable violent conflicts like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that's going to make it a lot harder. It's making it a lot harder to instill hope.
Yeah. Well, negativity bias and pessimism bias are, basic constructs of human mental functioning, and so I think, it's like some analogy where it's like, people, if someone's like feeling, increasingly more pessimistic, a little bit of hope or a little thing won't really shift them too much. But if someone's feeling increasingly optimistic, a little bit of like one example of a negative example or negative experience can just completely derail all their optimism. It's just like, it's easier to derail optimism than it is pessimism.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and that's because of the negativity bias, which is a part of, our error management, which is like our safety mechanism. Is like, it's better to be safe than sorry. Better to assume the worst and not get killed than to assume not the worst and have the potential of getting killed. I mean, that's just the way most minds work.
Sure.
So it's tough. How do you get people to feel hope when they are really in a pessimistic state or cynical state?
Yeah. And I think, the key that you see so much too is, is perception and also your willingness, to want to resolve conflict. And I think that kind of all ties in hand with this. And it's really hard to get people to do that, especially in areas that it's so ingrained to be the opposite.
Well, that's a huge thing. Even in the workplace, it's a huge thing of like the motivation level to actually do the work, put in the effort. You're going to be uncomfortable. So you have to like be up for that. And you have to have a high level of motivation to be up for that. And the only way to have some motivation is to feel some level of optimism that this thing's going to work. Because otherwise, what's the point of me being uncomfortable and putting in this effort? So I think that's a big part of what we do too, is like, how do we get people to feel at least some hope or optimism about this process? Hey, we can resolve this in some way.